Hello there, I'm Luca Ricci and I'm a composer. In today's lesson, we will talk about the music of the Renaissance. When analyzing historic repertoire, it's important to comprehend the history context and thought behind that repertoire. We already covered the topics of Renaissance music in the first lesson of the intermediate counterpoint course, with a short panoramic on 500 years of music history. As such, this lesson will be considered a deep dive in music history to understand more profoundly the thought of the composers we will analyze in the next lessons. So, without any further ado, let's do further and dive into the music of the Renaissance. Renaissance music sees its origins in Western liturgical music between the end of the 4th century to the 10th century AD, with the wide use of melodies and forms that were created for the liturgical functions. In medieval Europe, the most important autonomous forms of liturgies before the Romanization of the rites were three. The Greek Byzantine rites, which developed in the Eastern Mediterranean Sea, the Gallican rite, practiced in France, the Mozarabic rite, which developed until the end of 11th century in the Iberian Peninsula. Of the ancient Roman rite, which was present in Italy until the 4th century, we only have some late transcription for the 11th to 13th century, displaying characteristics that are very different from the Gregorian repertoire. The tendency to proceed with more linear melody without ample leaps, a strong delimitation of the melodic line in terms of register, the strong use of merismas, which meant that every syllable was embellished with more notes. Ambrosian chant is a variant of this rite, born around the end of the 4th century AD in northern Italy from the works of Sant'Ambrogio, which created some of the first Latin hymns. Ambrosian chants are defined by a wide variety of styles due to the complexity of northern Italy's liturgical tradition. The one we're going to hear now is a more melismatic and unstable one, referencing the singing style of the Eastern Byzantine music, which made frequent use of microtonal intonation and embellishments. The Gregorian repertoire, which will define the music of the centuries to come, takes the name from Pope Gregorio Magno in the 6th century AD in Rome, which compiled a collection of chants for the liturgy. These chants and this aesthetic became from the 11th century onwards to the 20th century the foundations of liturgical music. The development of this style of music, more simple than the ancient Roman rites chants, is thought to be due to the exchange of singers from the Western Roman Empire and the Franks. Pope Gregorio Magno didn't clearly intend to unify the singing style of the various rites, as we don't have any documents stating an intervention on this side of the liturgy. But in the 11th century, we clearly have an intervention by Rome with the intent to educate the barbarian Franks in the elegant singing of the Roman Empire. This operation by the Church did not go well, and was in fact full of problems. Rome blamed the savage barbarism of the Franks, incapable of understanding and assimilate the elegance of the Roman chants, while the Franks accused Rome of planning a conspiracy to teach in the worst way possible their singing tradition because of jealousy of the Franks' political power. Apart from these intellectual skirmishes, it's natural that the forced teaching of the Romans chants concluded with a hybrid product. As mentioned previously, the Roman chant made frequent use of microtones, which resulted very difficult for the Franks, not used to this kind of practice. This contamination resulted in a Frank-Roman chant, which is at the foundation of the Gregorian repertoire.
Victime Paschali laudes, immolent Christiani.
It's told that around the year 600 AD, Pope Gregorio Magno dictated these chants to a monk. A dove, sitting on the Pope's shoulder, suggested the chants phrase after phrase. The message is clear: the Holy Spirit invented the new chants. The presumed divine origin of the Gregorian chant was assimilated to the Bible and as such had to be transmitted without an imitation. This fact resulted in the modern concept of repertoire, a well-defined corpus of pieces that had to be kept identical through history. This also resulted in the gradual sunset of the improvisation practice in the liturgy. Improvisation became relegated to some parts of the rite, in tropes and sequences, and in polyphonic enrichment of chants. To maintain the chants during the centuries, a need for musical notation arose, and as such, also the teaching methodology changed. With the Naomi, we have the first clear example of musical notation. At first, they consisted of simple strokes above the words, to represent the general direction of the line, ascending, descending, or stable. But as centuries went by and new chants were invented, a need for a more clear and precise notation occurred, to consent the monks to remember and play by imprint the new chants, with the invention of the tetrachord and more complex notation means by monk Guido d'Arezzo. The role of music, or any other art, in the liturgy has always been to amplify the emotional impact of the rite. The power of music is to awaken the feelings in people without any concrete reference to the world around them. Unlike visual arts, which rely on concrete subjects, music has the power to amplify a crowd's feelings by rhythm and melody alone, thanks to how our brain perceives and internalizes certain aspects of music. This role was expanded in the Gregorian practice, firstly horizontally, and in later centuries, vertically. Tropes and sequences consists in amplification by adding new words and melodies to already existing melismas in already existing chants. In some ancient chants, there were long melismas held on one syllable. New texts were added to amplify the already existing text, amplifying the emotional power of the chant, and were called tropes. Sequences, instead, probably originated from prose works adapted to Alleluia's melism, and became totally autonomous compositions. Tropes were abolished by the Council of Trent in the 16th century, but 5 sequences survived until our modern times. Vertical amplification, on the other hand, happened in the later centuries with the inclusion of polyphonic practices in the rites. Polyphony was the ideal answer to the need to augment the rite solemnity, without any alteration to the original chant. It is but a vertical amplification, like tropes and sequences are horizontal amplification. In Paris, from half 12th century to 14th century, the Ars Antiqua, meaning ancient art, was born. Rhythmic notation was the technical expedient which allowed for polyphony to flourish, allowing for 3, 4, or more voices to sing together different lines and melodies. The intimate connection between music and words, and thus spoken rhythm, used to make rhythm notation superfluous, but at the end of 12th century, to control more complex polyphonies, the need to notate rhythm arose, to consent voices to sing together in a perfect game of interlocks. This first polyphonic practice is called organum, in which the voices sing together in unison different intervals. The group of musicians that invented this practice is called Notre Dame School. The first composer of the Notre Dame School was Magister Leoninus, which lived in the second half of 12th century. Leoninus was Optimus organist, and composed a Magnus Liber of Organa to amplify the liturgy. Leoninus' Organa were 2 voice compositions based on pre-existing Gregorian chants, with a second voice above that sang its new melody. The voice which sang the original chant was called tenor, while the second voice was called duplum. Usually, the tenor sang the chant with its rhythmic values doubled and augmented, but in more melismatic moments of the original chant, it sang in an intricate dialogue with the duplum. These compositions were called clausole. The second most important composer of the Ars Antiqua was Magister Perotinus, which lived between 1155 and 1225. Clausulae were clearly the most creative parts of the organum that could interest the composer more. Some new clausulae were then composed to substitute the originals, now ancient and of a different sensibility. Perotinus' generation, decades distant from Leoninus, used more voices in their songs. Clausulae used to work like long melismas held on singular syllables, that quickly became a limit for the Ars Antiqua composers, and thus the motet was born from the tropes technique. In the 12th and 14th century, motets quickly became an autonomous composition form, which could be executed outside of liturgical contexts. Its most important characteristics is to be polytextual. While the tenor, which still uses liturgical melodies, is usually played by an instrument, the other voices are given their own text in Latin or in French. Apart from the lyrics differences, the voices of the motet were distinguished with different speeds. Usually the tenor was singing long notes, and above them the motetus or duplum sang more fast melodies, while the triplum, the most high voices of them all, proceeded with an even more fast rhythm. It was almost like a representation of the stars' movements. Similar to the motet, we have the conductus, which differentiated for the tenor singing a free invention melody instead of a liturgical one. The period that succeeded the Notre Dame school saw an incredible advancement in music notation in the research for elegance and utility. Soon after the half of the 13th century, still in the Ars Antiqua, a new principle was applied, on which later music semiography will base itself on: the correspondence between the written and the heard. Until then, as a matter of fact, the same symbol had multiple meanings based on the context. Starting from the treaty Ars Cantus Mensurabilis by Francone di Colonia, the different note values started having their own symbols, starting what we now know as mensural music, music that was measurable in terms of precise rhythm. The principle that is the basis of this notation is that every note value can be subdivided either in 3 perfecta or in 2 imperfecta subdivisions. We have then the maxima, which length was equal to the 3 longa, which was equal to 3 brevis, which was equal to 3 semibrevis. Around the start of 14th century in France, a big change occurred. The Ars Nova, New Art, was born, which stated that the binary subdivision was equal to the ternary subdivision, and a new rhythmic value was added, the minima. Each rhythmic value could then be subdivided in 2 or 3 subdivisions that were considered philosophically equal, thanks to a new symbol at the beginning of the piece, which would later become the meter. Against the innovation of the Ars Nova, however, around 1320, a violent debate occurred, which saw the Church's position against the new French personalities. The concept of Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, could not be made equal as the concept of duality, which is imperfect. Ars Nova's position were thought as heretical. However, in the Ars Nova, we had much stronger personalities, like Philippe de Vitry and Guillaume de Machaut, which unconsciously moved music to a more autonomous position to the lyrics, with more emphasis on the form of the pieces, which were now based on strictly mathematical principles. History will prove the Ars Nova as the winner of this debate, with later music distancing more from the clear intangibility of the lyrics and the more emphasis on contrapunctual writing. In Italy, however, while there were big innovations regarding the musical form, they still depended heavily on the lyrics. The 1300s madrigal were 2 voices strophical pieces and were called as such because they were sung in their mother tongue, matricalis. The caccia, on the other hand, put the staples for an important technique which will be used for centuries to come, the canon. Sung on lyrics which depicted scenes of fierce hunt, the caccia consisted on a voice that started singing a line, and a second voice imitating that same line some moments later, repeating note by note everything the first voice sang.
Poste
With Philippe de Vitry and Guillaume de Machaut's innovations on musical forms, the line of thought quickly became the opportunity to detach music form from the lyrics and pursue more abstract choices using mathematical proportions. Isorhythmy was the first solution, subdividing the tenor's length in identical time proportions with the same rhythmic characteristics. Numeric symbolism was another way to create complex musical forms based on the mathematic proportions, with the 3 symbolizing the Holy Trinity, the 4 symbolizing man and the cardinal virtues, and 7 symbolizing the recapitulation of everything, from God to man and the world. Palindromes were another way of using mathematics proportion that were used by the Ars Nova composers. Numeric proportions is another criteria used since Perotinus, which consists in dividing the composition in sections that are proportional between them. The golden section is another incredible tool for mathematic proportions, which finds its reason in the search for geometric criteria. It will be used for centuries to come, up to our days. Between the end of the 14th and the beginning of the 15th century, these two tendencies started converging. This was the birth of Ars Subtilior, which combined Italian and French elements, obtaining results of incredible elegance and refinement. Thanks to the richness brought by commercial traffics in the Flemish region, big cathedrals were built, and professional singers' chapels were born, and medieval music ended. Generally, Blemishes are subdivided in 6 generations. The first generation, which takes place in the first half of the 1400s, belongs to Guillaume de Fay, which pioneered form by making extensive use of the mathematics principles we mentioned earlier. This generation traveled in all Europe, with Dufay working even in Rimini, Italy, near where I live. The second generation, taking place in the middle of 1400s, was more sedentary. Johannes Hockeghem, friend of Binchois, worked in Paris and pioneered incredible counterpoint works of wonderful complexity. The third generation, taking place near the beginning of the 1500s, found a new flux of trembling composers to Italy. Josquin de Pré, probably a student of Hockeghem, followed roads similar to Dufay's. The fourth generation, which takes place in the first half of the 1500s, will be fundamental for Italy's music development, thanks to the efforts of Adrien Villaert, Cipriano d'Arore, Philippe Verdelot, and Jacques Sarcadelt. The fifth generation, taking place in the second half of the 1500s, sees great improvements to counterpoint techniques and musical emotion effects, thanks to the works of Orlando di Lasso, Philippe de Monte, and Jacques de Vert. The sixth generation, now in the first Baroque era, sees the works of Jean Zwelling, which founded the organistic school that saw Buxtehude and Bach as his principal composers. In the 15th century, the motet started to turn from a liturgical form to a profane form, destined for public ceremonies, thanks to its use as an intellectual elite's way to pass time. Polytextuality began to disappear, and Latin, being the language of solemn moments, became the language of the motet. This closed the circle, and in the 16th century motet returned to be a sacred form. During the Flemish period in Renaissance music, the tendency to a variety that characterized medieval music started to disappear, becoming a desire of unity, which meant the disappearance of polytextuality and new parameters to use in music composition. Counterpoint now was the main way to create coherent music, and this happened through the use of different techniques. Coherence meant using the same melodic material, but changing it based on fundamental principles like retrogradation, in which the phrase is played backwards, or inversion, in which the phrase is played like through a horizontal mirror, inverting the intervals. Imitation was also a very powerful tool for coherence, and the canon is the prime example of a strict imitation, loved by the Flemish composers, up to the point of creating enigmatic canons, consisting in one voice with a riddle to solve the other voices. The cantus firmus, the practice of having the melody augmented in length in the tenor, was another way of elaborating existing materials into new forms. In the 30s and 40s of the 500s, Attagnan published a new type of chanson. Its less contrapuntal nature distinguished it from the old French chanson, which was similar to the motet apart from the profane lyrics, and the voices proceeded with homorhythmic values. The vast diffusion of the French chanson made it so that the new instruments built around the 15th and 16th century became important in the playing of these pieces. French chansons arranged for instruments became quite common in the 1500s. The canzone da sonar, or song to be played, is the last step in the chanson's evolutionary progress, and acted as a first start for the instrumental Baroque forms, and became the ancestor to the sonata. In the first half of the 16th century, the new push to bring music close together with the lyrics made it so that Italian poet Pietro Bembo specified that in poetry, the rhythm of the words have a direct repercussion on the meaning of the words. A word is not interchangeable with a synonym, because that would mean a change in the sound and thus in the meaning of the phrase, using as the basic structure of the Italian language Petrarca's poetry works and Boccaccio's prose works. With that in mind, music could not be thought anymore as a separate entity from the text. The frottola, which was a strophic form in which the same melody was sung with different lyrics, wasn't anymore on par with the aesthetic standards of the Renaissance, and as such, music now needed to be more flexible to accommodate the lyrics' own meaning and rhythm.
grillo è buon cantore che tiene lungo verso. Dale, dale, beve, beve, grillo, grillo, canta, canta, dale, dale, beve, beve, grillo, grillo, canta. Il grillo è buon cantore che tiene lungo verso. Dale, dale, beve, beve, grillo, grillo, canta, canta, dale, dale, beve, beve, grillo, grillo, canta. Il grillo è buon cantore, ma non fa cori al cruceli, come lì han cantato un poco, quando è fatto in altro loco, sempre il grillo sta pulsando, quando la maggiore è caldo, allora canta solo per amore, per amore. Quando la maggiore è caldo, allora canta solo per amore, per amore. E il grillo è buon cantore che tiene lungo verso. Dale, dale, beve, beve, grillo, grillo, canta, canta, dale, dale, beve, beve, grillo, grillo, canta. E il grillo è buon cantore, il grillo è buon cantore.
The madrigal was the answer to this need of a strict relationship between music and poetry, a form which was sung by voices only, and which was based on the form of the poetry's lyrics. During Villaert and Cipriano da Lore's life, they came in contact with the madrigal and infused them of Flemish counterpoint, amplifying the expressive possibilities of the form. The madrigal then became the profane counterpart of the motet, with the form becoming a staple for many composers, such as Orlando di Lasso, Palestrina, Luca Marenzio, Carlo Gesualdo, and Claudio Monteverdi, which brought the madrigal up to the shores of the first Baroque era. This strict relationship between the music and poetry also birthed the techniques we know as madrigalisms or madrigalismi, which consists in onomatopoeic representations of concepts in music through all the techniques and melodic possibilities that are granted to the art of music. Meanwhile, in 1517, Luther began the Lutheran reform, which will have decisive consequences also in the music field. The active participation of the believers in the rite was one of the staples of Luther's thesis, and one of the main ways in which this could be achieved was with music. Luther wrote and commissioned many easy new chants, often derived from popular songs, and explained how the relationship between music and lyrics should be strict to amplify the liturgy. The Roman Church didn't wait much, and with the Counter-Reform during Trent's Council redefined liturgical music. Gregorian chants were cleaned of the tropes and sequences, restoring its ancient glory, and profane tendencies inside the masses were eliminated, like parody masses, which were written on profane cantus firmus. Last but not least, lyrics comprehension was one of the big staples of the Counter-Reformation, and all the counterpoint techniques were to be kept at bay, with a more homorhythmic conduct. Giovanni Pierluigi da Palestrina was the most prolific and important composer of the Counter-Reformation, clearly representing this sort of cleansing by the Church, with a more pure and simple yet hauntingly beautiful type of music, which maybe resembles more the common practice musicians study today in music universities and conservatoires. With the invention of the opera in the latest years of the 500s, the growing importance of instrumental music and the evolution of counterpoint techniques, which simplifies modes and starts to become tonal, we enter the Baroque era, a period of complex and beautiful contrapuntal music. In the next lesson, we will talk about the motet Super Cantus Firmus. See ya!